Pearl T. Robinson has authored more than 40 articles and book chapters on African and African American politics. She is co-author of Stabilizing Nigeria: Sanctions, Incentives, and Support for Civil Society from the Century Foundation Press, and co-editor and co-author of Transformation and Resiliency in Africa, Howard University Press.
So I'm going to try to give you an overview of U.S. Africa policy under the two administrations of President Obama. If you look back at the pictures of the first administration, he looks like a young guy, and now he's got silver hair, and to a certain extent, I think his approach towards Africa has undergone that kind of maturation as well. U.S. Africa policy under the Obama administration, if you want it from the horse's mouth, is captured in 4 speeches. There's the Cairo speech. I consider Egypt part of Africa. The Accra, Ghana speech, a speech that he gave to young African leaders at a summit that was held at the White House, and most recently, President Obama's speech to the people of Africa given at the African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa in July of 2015. The State Department's Bureau of African Affairs focuses on the development and management of U.S. policy concerning Africa. If you go to their website, you will see that there are 4 pillars that serve as the foundation of its work. These are strengthening democratic institutions, supporting African economic growth and development, advancing peace and security, and promoting opportunity and development. Regional topics that concern the State Department are implemented through specific programs and initiatives. The programs and initiatives that are a current focus include trade and business via the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, women's justice and empowerment via the Women's Justice and Empowerment Initiative, education via the African Education Initiative, health issues including global hunger and food security, Ebola, HIV/AIDS, and malaria, and the recurring drought that takes place in the Horn of Africa, parts of the Sahel, and which the emphasis is on humanitarian assistance to refugees, internally displaced persons, and drought-affected populations. Regions in Africa with large Muslim populations have become sites for a new Obama foreign policy that would avoid large land wars like those in Afghanistan and Iraq, and instead emphasize the training of allied and partner nations to battle militants on their own soil. Since the attacks on September 11th, 2001, the United States has slowly built a multi-pronged counterterrorism strategy in regions of Africa with large Muslim populations. They've done this by carrying out armed drone strikes in Somalia from Djibouti, by backing African proxies and French commandos fighting Islamist extremists in Somalia and Mali, and developing counterterrorism programs to train African troops to combat insurgents. For countries with governments strong enough to articulate and implement policies based on a clear view of their own national interests, counterterrorism programs may be deemed helpful, which is to say not all of these countries are able to articulate a clear view of their own national interests. Under the New Africa Plan, the Pentagon is spending nearly $70 million on training, intelligence gathering equipment, and other support to build a counterterrorism battalion in Niger and a similar unit in nearby Mauritania. According to Maman Sidikou, Niger's former ambassador to the United States and the United Nations, quote, training remains a critical part of our needs to further increase our men's readiness to face the many challenges of our regional environment, unquote. In May 2014, the Obama administration signed a 20-year lease on its military base in Djibouti in the Horn of Africa. This is the only American installation on the continent and a staging ground for counterterrorism operations in Yemen and Somalia. However, in Mali, American-trained commandos of elite army units defected to Islamic insurgents that seized the north in January 2013. So not all of these people we train remain allies working in partnership with the United States. In Libya, the most ambitious initial training ended in August 2014 after a group of armed militia fighters overpowered a small Libyan guard force at a training base outside of Tripoli and stole hundreds of American-supplied automatic weapons, night vision goggles, vehicles, and other equipment. In addition, the United States has, and this is actually a program that began under the Bush administration, but it has continued to develop its resources under AFRICOM. This is the U.S. Africa Command. Its mission is to deter and defeat transnational threats, to protect U.S. security interests, to prevent future conflicts, and to support humanitarian and disaster relief. I think that AFRICOM has one of the best websites for information about Africa that's out there. And every now and then, just when I'm sitting around thinking, I wonder what's going on in Africa, I turn to the AFRICOM website, and I recommend it to my students. You'll find out a lot about what we're doing if you go there. Now, Barack Obama's, so we step back a little bit to the beginning of the Obama administration. Barack Obama's election as President of the United States was initially hailed by Africans as a new voice for Africans everywhere. African-American journalist Charlene Hunter Galt dubbed it the Obama phenomenon. Anticipation that Africans would have an advocate in the White House who would champion their cause, a U.S. president who would instinctively understand the legacies of colonialism and the ongoing forms of economic exploitation, a champion who would help eliminate Africa's ongoing poverty and address the blight inflicted by leaders corrupted by power. But President Obama has never missed an opportunity to remind his African admirers that he is the President of the United States, not the President of Africa. His hallmark toward Africa has been tough love. The Obama administration has placed its rhetorical emphasis on a vision of what Africa can become. And in many ways, that's kind of what we need. That's certainly what I try to, a message I try to give to my students. You're looking at what's there. Think about what it could become and try to figure out how you can relate your life to that. During President Obama's first term, the basic tenets of his administration's Africa policy were outlined in 3 of those 4 speeches I mentioned. June 4th, 2009, the Cairo speech. And he has a nice name, Remarks by the President on a New Beginning. The focus was on Islam, and he was hosted by 2 of Egypt's leading universities, Al-Azhar, a site of Islamic learning for over 1,000 years, and Cairo University. Obama framed the speech around a new beginning and shared common principles. I actually won't go into the details of this because we know that this kind of was the prelude to the Arab Spring, that if it was a new beginning, it fizzled quickly. But I put I mentioned the Cairo speech in terms of talking about Obama's Africa policy because for many people, they saw that as the Middle East. And then they think there's the Sub-Saharan Africa speech was the speech for Accra. Muslims are a large percentage of Africa's population. And I do a lot of work in Niger, which has a population of over 90% Muslim, and other parts of the West African Sahel. And for these people, that speech was talking to them as Africans. And one can't overstate the degree to which that speech was seen very positively by Muslims in Africa. And in some way, there may even be more lingering positive effect in sub-Saharan Africa of that speech than in North Africa. July 11th, 2009, the Accra speech. This was the president addressing the Ghanaian parliament right after Ghana had had successful elections, carried through, power shifted from an incumbent to an opposition leader, and it was their fourth multi-party democratic election, making Ghana the beacon for the possibilities of a fully democratic African continent. So this speech focused on governance and democracy. Several of the U.S.'s major African allies felt slighted. Nigeria, which is the most populous country on the African continent and had served the United States well as a regional hegemon, helping it with civil wars and peacekeeping in the region, felt slighted. Kenya, the birthplace of Obama's father, and one of the most reliable U.S. strategic partners in the East African sub-region, felt that he should have made his first speech as president in Kenya. South Africa, the second largest African economy, the regional hegemon in Southern Africa, and an important U.S. strategic partner in the region, said, well, why are you going to Ghana and not coming down here to South Africa? And after all, we have Nelson Mandela. So why Ghana? President Obama wanted to spotlight Ghana's vibrant democracy. Ghana had just come through hotly contested elections that forced a runoff when roughly 8,000 votes separated the two presidential candidates. When the dust settled, the incumbent party had lost. John Atta Mills, a law professor, became Ghana's new president, and not a single person was injured or killed due to electoral violence. I teach a course on mitigating electoral violence in Africa, so that's a big deal. Sticking with his Cairo message, Obama articulated the goals of democracy building and economic prosperity. He outlined 4 principal goals of a vision of what Africa can become: democratic, a land of opportunity, a place where people can aspire to a good healthcare system, and the peaceful resolution of conflicts. President Obama linked his vision of what Africa could become with a message of tough love to rulers who perpetuate conflicts, abuse human rights, and deny women's rights. He took aim at some of Africa's failures and laid them at the feet of Africa's leaders. And then he made his famous statement that people like to repeat and that makes many in Africa angry. Africa doesn't need strong men, it needs strong institutions. African journalists criticized Obama, some African journalists criticized Obama for not mentioning the legacies of oppression that have held Africa back: colonialism, social Darwinism, the Cold War, and the causes of Africa's marginalization in the global political economy. Moving forward, August 3rd, 2010, remarks at President Obama's White House town hall for young African leaders. He titled this speech, "Rooting for Success," thinking about the future. This speech focused on leadership, more particularly promoting renewed values by nurturing the next generation of leadership in African civil society. The State Department convened a Young African Leaders Summit to mark the 50th anniversary of African independence. A gathering of 120 young African leaders from 48 sub-Saharan African countries attended. Those invited came from the ranks of civil society, not the government. The program reflected the mindset of Obama of Obama, the community organizer. The forum included small group discussions on topics such as transparency and accountability, job creation and entrepreneurship, rights and advocacy, the use of technology to empower individuals and communities. And President Obama's message to the group was, the destiny of Africa is going to be determined by Africans. Being a partner means we are rooting for your success, but we can't do it for you. Now, the major engagement of the Obama administration's second term was the U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit that was held from the 4th to the 6th of August in 2014. The notion of partnership was reworked to imply a more robust, dynamic engagement. The largest event any U.S. president has held with African heads of state and government, this summit aimed to strengthen ties between the United States and Africa, and an Africa that is now touted as one of the world's most dynamic and fastest growing regions. Obama is fond of saying that he does not see the countries and peoples of Africa as a world apart. Rather, he sees Africa as a fundamental part of our connected world, partners with America on behalf of the future we want for all of our children. That partnership must be grounded in mutual responsibility and mutual respect. The summit theme was investing in the next generation. Programmatically, the focus was on trade and investment in Africa. The summit also highlighted America's commitment to Africa's security, its democratic development, and its people. The various discussion panels and groups discussed ways to stimulate growth, unlock opportunities, and create an enabling environment for the next generation. They also established a Mandela Washington Fellowship for young African leaders. And this is a new program that brings 500 young leaders to the United States each year, beginning in 2014, for leadership training, academic coursework, and mentoring. The 2014 cycle coincided with the U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit. The administration hopes to make this program permanent, but I think that will be up to the next administration. Now, I just want to conclude with a few remarks, sort of some idea put forward by political scientist Nick van der Waal in his recent foreign policy issue article on Obama's foreign policy, where he and van der Waal wrote the piece on Africa policy. In that, he maps U.S.-Africa policy with 3 regions, much more succinctly than what I have done, and characterizes the policy with respect to these regions. The first region he singles out is the Sahel, region I work a lot in. A strip that goes from West Africa and Senegal to East Africa, the Horn of Africa. In this region, you have Africa's weakest states, its poorest economies, and its largest ungoverned spaces. The majority of Africans who live in this region are Muslim. Militarization of U.S. policy in the Sahel has accelerated under the Obama administration. We have a new drone base in Niger. We've expanded the drone bases in Ethiopia and Djibouti. We are developing military alliances with friendly powers in the region. In Libya, we removed Gaddafi from power, but what that did was to cause new regional security threats. Lots of refugees, lots of small arms, no stable functioning government in Libya. So that particular activity has made the West African Sahel far more dangerous than it used to be. what the United States is primarily doing in terms of its security activities, operations in this region, is helping to keep America safe from the terrorist threat by helping to build up the military capacity of the governments that we are able to work with. The second region he focuses on is the Great Lakes region. The Great Lakes region in Central Africa. The countries in particular, which we have spent a lot of time dealing with long even before the Obama administration, Sudan, South Sudan, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and when I say Sudan and South Sudan, if I add to that Darfur, many people here will recognize that issue. This is the region in which grave humanitarian disasters have occupied a lot of our energy and focus. It is the region in which the United States policy is framed largely in humanitarian terms. We have expanded the hunt for Kony, who about 15 years ago was doing some really bad things in Uganda and hasn't been in Uganda for over 10 years. And the president of Uganda said he's not worried about Kony anymore, but the U.S. is. U.S. diplomats have participated in negotiations to reduce civil conflict and human rights abuses in this region. And on that score, they have done good work worthy of praise. And the U.S. has, under the Obama administration, the U.S. has continued the Bush practice of working through Uganda and Rwanda to try to resolve the various crises that take place in Congo. We are spending about $2 billion a year on peacekeeping and humanitarian assistance in this region. And then what I like is van der Waals says that that third region where he maps the third region of Africa in terms of our concern, he refers to it as the rest of Africa, and these are the bright spots. These are the parts of Africa where we talk in rather optimistic and hopeful terms about investment opportunities, development, electrifying Africa, democratization, good governance. And so I'll just sort of conclude by saying that was a very, very brief overview of the Obama Africa policy. Many people who try to study it kind of say, well, is there really a policy, or are we responding to events that really are either local or relate to our policies and strategic engagement in other regions of the world. But that's essentially what they're doing.
So I have a question about the Obama policy, really. It seems that in Africa, China and Russia have directed policies toward Africa to increase the level of infrastructure in Africa. We seem to be doing nothing. They're cornering the markets in lots of very valuable commodities that are needed for growth even in Western countries, while we are doing nothing in response. I'm interested in knowing if that's going to change, or do we have to wait for another administration to change it?
That's a very good question, and when I was president of the African Studies Association, it was during the Bush administration. And the Bush administration, in terms of trying to figure out what our China policy would be, one of the sort of small things they did was to have dialogues with Chinese counterparts on various topics. And so they had a dialogue, U.S.-China dialogues on policy towards Africa. And I was the one academic who was part of the group who went. People from industry, human rights people. We were a small group. There were 8 of us. Oil guy. And our hosts were the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. And we sat around a table, and the person who was the head of our delegation was former U.S. ambassador to Kenya. He made a statement, Then we had another woman, human rights Nigerian American, who made a comment about China's human rights things. And so those two people spoke. And then on the Chinese side of the table, the woman, she's a political scientist and sort of their head researcher she does a lot of work on China in Africa. She said, let me tell you what we're doing in Africa. The Chinese government over the past decades has brought hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. And we are now making our model available to Africa. One of the things that involves is building infrastructure. The United States seems to be focused on microfinance for women and bringing elections. It's up to the Africans to decide what they want. They've already had 5 decades of Western delivered development. And where are they? They are at the bottom of every index of human development. So it's up to them. They want to keep doing that. And yes, in exchange for that, we are getting minerals, sort of strategic minerals, to continue moving forward. So we have a foreign policy, an Africa policy, that is a part of a policy, our domestic policy, but we're making our model available to them. And I sat there thinking, God, we don't have a good answer for that. And we need to start thinking about, if in fact you think democracy is important, you have to ask, why is it you think roads aren't important? Why is it you think sort of basic infrastructure is not? For 4 years, I ran a winter break study tour to Ghana. It was Ghana Coal, a corporate social responsibility study tour. And we would visit gold mines. When I started it, there were no good paved roads to any of the gold mines, but the Chinese were building the roads. At the end of that 4th year, we went every place on paved roads. And just a little thing like that, you can see it makes a difference. As far as I can tell, I don't anticipate whoever the next administration is doing infrastructure. But maybe what that will take is, what are we, citizens, lobbying to have more of that done. And if somebody wants to counter my view, I'd be glad to know what it is, and maybe I'll do some of that too. The big thing with the Obama administration right now is this Electrify Africa, and it was just last month they were saying, well, they had that big summit a year ago, but to date there is not a dollar that has been spent to put even a light bulb, to light up a single light bulb. So they're trying to get together the private investment where people want to invest in that. I was in Ghana last summer. The CD fell 40%. So I was in Niger, and then I was going to Ghana to do some work for Tufts. And while I was in Niger, the value of the CD dropped 40%. CD is their currency. When I was in the cab going to the airport listening to the news, they were interviewing somebody, one of these big investors who had gone to Ghana, because you can see all these buildings and things that are going up, at least in Accra. I didn't know where I was. And at that particular point, the regional governments out in the north or someplace had not paid their petroleum bill for 5 months, so the government said they stopped delivering petrol. And therefore, there was no electricity. So they had an investor, a foreign investor said, if this country can't guarantee that we're going to have electricity, we're going to rethink these investments that we started making. And that's the bottom line for us. So that even this notion that foreign investors will do it all, without the infrastructure, most of them won't.
Hi. I have a question about how to reconcile the United States security position of cutting off countries like Somalia from the financial system with, like you said, the backing of microfinance, and what is the state of access to banking, et cetera, in, say, the Sahel or other parts of Africa?
Those are sort of two questions. and I'll answer them as best I can. Last night, I'm a C-SPAN junkie, so last night I watched the confirmation hearing for the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Treasury for this finance stuff, money, the black money. And so they talked about how this is very important for our security. People who are laundering money and everything. I remember the day that they actually, one of the people who was on the trip with me to China was a lawyer, international law firm, and some of his clients were these bankers who were dealing with the Somali money. And he was explaining to me how these people with bicycles, and people can send money from here, there, and how important it had been to try to sort of support that and doing the legal things related to it. So I paid great attention to the announcement that they had shut down these banks. I don't understand that. I think that's a problem. I understand the idea that we're trying to dry up sources of financing that can do harm to the United States. Probably because I spend a lot of time in that Sahel part of Africa, I can see how easy it is for terrorists to buy people. And I'll just give an example. As I spent 7 years working on this movie. I'd go in the summer, and I'd always, my birthday is July the 4th, and so I always try to get an invitation to the Embassy 4th of July party. So I got to know the embassy people well. And one summer, the DCM said to me, well, I hope you're not planning to go to Maradi. I said, well, I'd love to go, but I'm editing up in Tawa. I said, well, why? He said, because we've learned from the chatter that they're looking for Americans to kidnap. And the price for an American right now is $41,000. I said, well, what do you mean? That doesn't sound like it. He said, no. The $41,000 for the Nigerian on the street who kidnaps an American and hands him over to a terrorist group that will then ask for $1 million, $2 million, $3 million. Country where the average per capita income for a year is less than $1,000, you can kidnap an American and get $41,000. Would you stay clear of the terrorists? And what would you do if the $100 or a couple $100 a month you got from your family in the United States is cut off? So in some ways, I think that people don't think through the whole chain of consequences of some of these policies. And it may just be that things that seem to make sense, ways to keep America safe, some of these strategies are developed by people who operate in bubbles. And people like Mama Chota, the existence of people like that, you have no idea they exist. When I showed this, by the way, to the people at the embassy and the USAID people who were blown away with just the images, they said, well, have any of them ever done any work with us? And I said, why are you asking me? If they have, you would know them, wouldn't you? And then they said, well, how would we make contact with them? I felt like saying, if you can't figure that out, we shouldn't be paying you to be in Niger. Instead, what I said is we're inviting 35 of them to the screening of my film. And so when they're here, maybe you might want to talk with some of them and invite them back here and say that you would like to visit them and see some of the things they're doing. But yeah, so problems. But when I say my sins, these are all things, if you identify them as problems, think about the kind of career you might want to make for yourself, and maybe you can address some of these. Yes.
All right, thank you very much for your presentation. My name is Daniel Thiambiano from Ghana, West Africa, and I'm very happy that you presented quite a beautiful portrait of my country, and rightly so. I would want to say that the reason why, relative to your question, the reason why Africa's trade with China in the past 10 years far exceeds America's trade with Africa, its entire trade, is not one that is shrouded in a myth, because we have learned some bitter lessons from our experience with America. You can take a typical case of the Structural Adjustment Program, which, if we will be sincere with ourselves, has been counterproductive to the interest of Africa. So for us back in Africa, as you may know, many of us have seen our historical relationship with America as counterproductive. And that explains why Africa seems to now adopt a look east policy. At least we can relate with the East. That mutual respect is there as against that master-servant relationship. And I just want to cite another case in point. After feeding various factions, for example, in Libya, with the weapons, after all is said and done, where do the weapons go? They stay right in Africa, and they make their way through to other countries. For example, a tribal conflict in my country has been fueled by ammunitions that are coming from Libya. But having said that, I would just want to ask, how can the United States of America, of course, like any other country, pursue her strategic interest in Africa and still remain true to her democratic values? Because for us in Africa, we feel that there is more talk about democracy, but hypocrisy practiced on the ground, and it has led to a lot of indignation, which for me, as a lover of America, married to an American, I think it's a very worrying trend.
Okay, so I have two things. First, to your first question or comment about China and Africa, one of the things that I think that I say often, and I think more people need to acknowledge, China has an Africa policy. Few African countries have a China policy. So China's approach to Africa is strategic. I kept the prep kit I had for those dialogues. One of them was a color-coded map of where Chinese diplomats were involved in negotiations with African countries for strategic minerals. And each mineral had a color. I actually gave a copy of this to a Ghanaian artist, and I said, I would like to see what you could do with this. But yeah, it's strategic. Various countries in Africa, and actually, this was one of my students, paper on this, who international relations major and was also doing China, had studied in China, took a course where they were looking at China and Africa, but also took a course where it was looking at rural development policy in China. And she said, you know, China's approach to developing the rural areas was strategic. They started off building infrastructure. They did these various things. They put in place agricultural banks. And so it's literally a transformative rural development policy and program. But it looks like for an African country, in one place maybe they will build a dam, and then they'll move on and do something else in another country. But the government doesn't have a strategic view of how it might use Chinese resources for its own comprehensive, transformative development program. And so she concluded, based on what she had learned about the Chinese approach and what she was learning about the Africa approach, that African countries need to have a China policy that's linked with a strategic vision of where they want to go. So the US and China both relate to Africa in terms of their national interests.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Robinson.
I think this is something that we all can do to choose that, to say to ourselves, this is something that I care about, I want to know enough about this, and I have to be willing to talk about it.